Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those who are watching us from France. I'm Sandrine Buteau, I'm the director of Albertine Bookstore, and I'm very pleased to welcome you on Zoom today for this conversation that we were supposed to host in person at Albertine end of January, when our guest, Pauline Baer de Perignon, came to New York for the auction of the painting Portrait d'une dame en Pomone by Nicolas de Largillière, which was restituted to Pauline and his family in January 21. The result of the long quest Pauline is narrating in her book, The Vanished Collection, which has just been published in the US by New Vessel Press. Because of the COVID situation, unfortunately, we are not able to host a conversation, but I have to say that at least if you are in New York City today, this is a perfect weather to enjoy this conversation in the comfort of our own apartments. I will not be long as I want to leave as much time as possible for our guests. Let me just introduce them to you. Pauline Baer de Perignon graduated in comparative literature at Oxford and studied screenplay at the French National Film School, La Fémis. She has co-authored film scripts and directed writing workshops in Paris, where she lives. The Vanished collection is her first book. Menachem Kaiser is the author of the memoir Plunder. He holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan and was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, and elsewhere. Michael Wise is a publisher of New Vessel Press and has worked as a correspondent in Vienna, Prague, and London, reporting for Reuters and the Washington Post. Before I leave the screen to Michael, who will moderate the conversation, I'm just telling you that we will take questions from the audience in about 45 minutes. And if you want to ask a question to our guest, please use the Q&A tab and I will read your questions. And I'm leaving the screen now to our three guests and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. The Vanished collection is a highly readable, suspenseful book that's repeatedly been likened to a detective novel in the way that Pauline recounts her quest to understand what happened to her great-grandfather's art collection during the Nazi occupation of Paris, and then her success in obtaining the return of some of those works 3/4 of a century later. Menachem's book, published last year, chronicles his own efforts to obtain the restitution of his grandfather's property in that ancestor's birthplace of Sosnowice in southern Poland. One book deals with paintings that ended up in state museums. The other deals with real estate. But both Pauline and Menachem are equally concerned with their own non-material inheritance, and we'll talk today about their shared and contrasting attitudes to family heirlooms, real and intangible. I'd like to start by asking Pauline to tell us a bit about who her great-grandfather Jules Strauss was, his importance as an art collector, and how she came to learn that his collection had been plundered during the occupation of Paris.
With pleasure. So my great-grandfather was called Jules Strauss. He was German. He was born in 1861 and arrived in Paris in his 20s. He came from a family who was quite fond of French culture. So he worked in a bank and he started collecting very early. His first sale in the 1909 was impressionist work, was about impressionist works, Sisley, Renoir, Monet, and Manet. He kept on collecting impressionists, and in the meantime, he collected 18th and 17th century European painting. He was also a donator to the Louvre and to the Musée Carnavalet. He gave 60 frames because he thought they were not well framed. The Italian Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci didn't have a proper frame. All his life, he worked on the art, the paintings he collected. It means he was very fond of provenance research, and he wrote a lot about what he collected. And he died during the Second World War. And I discovered by a strange coincidence that no, he didn't die quietly in his apartment, and that he was persecuted during the end of his life during the war as a Jewish collector. And how I discovered it, life is amazing, because just by chance, I ran into a cousin during a Brazilian concert, nothing to do with family. And he told me, oh, I think our grandfather, Jules Strauss, may have been looted. So well, that's the beginning of my investigation.
And can you tell us a little bit about how you successfully recovered the painting that Sandrine mentioned that was in the Dresden Museum? How you got it back and it was sold here in New York?
I'm glad to talk about this little issue, but I mean the idea first was to get to know an ancestor I knew nothing about, and to investigate on his life and what happened to him during the war, because my family never talked about it. I was not like Menachem would say, a treasure hunter first. Was more sentimental memory hunter, you would say, Menachem. So I was trying just to get to know the truth, and I discovered on Google that there were several paintings that had disappeared that may have been looted. So yes, I found there was a painting, the Madame de l'Argilière, hanging on the walls of Dresden Museum, and it took me 4 or 5 years. So don't lose hope, Menachem. So it took me a lot of time to get it back. But I really want to say it's not only about getting this painting back, because there's a loss, and this loss will never be repaired. Sorry to talk about a lot about your book, Menachem, but it's really true what you say. You can get back things, but there's always this idea of loss, what the people have gone through during the war, what memories have not been transmitted by the family. All these things are lost forever.
Well, both of you talk about how this quest to retrieve the property is also a way to access and understand your relatives, to get closer to a great-grandfather, or in Menachem's case, to a grandfather, and make these ancestors more than an abstraction. Can you each talk about, maybe Menachem, tell us a little bit about whether you succeeded in getting closer to understanding who your grandfather was through your search?
The short answer is no. But the longer answer is that, I didn't know my grandfather. And so I also had no conception of him. I would say he was kind of a blank. He died 8 years before I was born. He died when my father was in his mid-20s. And, just maybe owing to the temperament of the family, he just there weren't really stories about him. And so I grew up with I'm named after him. So there's some sort of spiritual rhyme there maybe, but I had just no conception of him. And I definitely didn't feel any drive or curiosity. So there really was no sentimental relationship. And so, I kind of stumbled into this reclamation of this property. And by the end, I wouldn't say I got closer to him, because I'm really try to be very honest about false sentimentality. And so I didn't get closer to him, but I feel like I started being able to at least form the questions. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like I did work that I find very meaningful. And I'm okay with projecting now. There was something sort of interesting and meaningful there for me. The book overall, the book as opposed to the building, and I'm curious how Pauline feels about this, the book as an object of connection rather than the object you're actually trying to go for. So in fact, at the end of the day, I didn't get the building back, or I'm still in the process of getting the building back. But I feel like the book is kind of an object that connects us much more than the actual inheritance itself.
Right. That's the recovery. Right. Both of you experienced skepticism within your families and from other people, your friends and people around you, about what you were undertaking and why you were doing this in the first place. I think, Menachem, you write about how your father said, why are you so obsessed with Zadie or with your grandfather? Yeah. Can you both talk about that and how people reacted to you and how you dealt with that?
Sure.
Yeah, it's funny because I received exactly the same comment. Why are you obsessed with this great grandfather you've never even met? I mean, what does it have to do with you? And I said, okay, maybe you're right. What am I projecting on him? Why am I getting attached to him? Why do I want to know everything about him? And I think it has something to do with the silence. I mean, with the fact that things have not been said in the family. When you say nothing about an ancestor, of course you're getting a bit curious, and you like some idea of where you come from, what kind of person you come from, what you have inherited, what's been transmitted or not. So, of course, my family was a bit surprised, but then they got curious as well. And I think they all started to connect to each other, and we all sent to each other what we had and pictures. And so it was the beginning of a small reunion around our common ancestor. Was it like that for you, Menachem?
It's different. My family is a very, very unsentimental family, but a very, very religious family. And so the fact that I was sort of pursuing this very material inheritance, I think was challenging for my family because it forced everyone to sort of interrogate what the inheritance actually is. And so what my father was responding to me, he was like, you know, because I'm not as orthodox as the rest of my family, not as observant. And, you know, my father was sort of framing that as a rejection of the inheritance that actually mattered. And so he found sort of a little bit of an affront. He was like, you know, you're sort of, you're deciding you have this special connection with your grandfather, and you're sort of selecting and choosing what to pull from that legacy. And so my father, you know, as the representative, let's call it, or as like sort of the most knowledgeable spokesperson, he was like, you know, that's not what your grandfather would have cared about. And so it was tough to hear, and it like forced some hard conversations and some hard introspection. And so, but ultimately, and it goes back to your earlier question, I felt very grateful for this much wider conversation of non-material inheritance, which is something just I had never really thought about, and we really sort of take for granted. And so we just have our notion of inheritance is so often tangible, like a thing is passed down, and but you're saying what else is there, you know, and to sort of interrogate what those dimensions were and how sometimes they conflict with each other. I found that to be, you know, really at the end of the day, that's what I took out of this entire endeavor.
Okay. You both had very different kinds of Jewish upbringings. In Menachem's family, Jewish religious practice was consciously transmitted, whereas in Pauline's, it was vigorously erased for decades. Did your inquiries change in some way your own relationship to Judaism and your own Jewish self-understanding? I mean, obviously your father wanted that perhaps it would make you perhaps more observant. Menachem, why don't you go first?
Did it, not, I wouldn't, you know, it didn't make me more religious. I didn't have anything I would say like an epiphany or things like that. But I think, you know, there's a sort of lesson buried, you know, the model I'm most familiar with is traditional Judaism. And, you know, I experience it as like sets of rules, you know, a lot of stricture, a lot of structure. I think embedded with that is this sort of this notion of legacy that isn't often articulated because it's really buried beneath a lot of rules and regulation and sort of ritual and a lot of, it's very formal. And I think what this did, it's that it helped me articulate that, like this notion of legacy and this notion of things getting passed down in ways that is very much encoded into the, you know, the sort of Orthodox Jewish culture, but it's hard to tease out. So it did help me that it helped me connect with the sense of tradition, which I feel again very grateful for.
Pauline?
Well, it's difficult for me to talk about a lot of writers and people have written about the Jewish identity. Even though nobody was religious in my family, I was always trying to figure out what's left in a family that has not been religious for 3 or 4 generations, and I still don't know. The only thing we have is that we've been persecuted as Jewish. I'm trying to find other ways to identify to the Jewish than the persecution, and I don't know what's left of this culture in my family. I still can't figure out, but I'm more and more curious and willing to find out. That's what I can say.
Apart from different attitudes toward Judaism, your families were just very different in their degrees of closeness and the connections between members of the family. And Menachem writes that the essence of being a family is pretending to be one. And I would say that made me think, well, Pauline's family often didn't even pretend that they kind of, there had been a kind of split among some members, or had been little contact. I mean, you tell us at the very beginning of your book that you hadn't seen this cousin for years, who then tells you something incredibly important about the family's identity.
Yeah.
So
No, it's true, but we didn't live in the same country. When I read about Menachem, of your family when you were a child, all living in the same street, I said, oh my God, it must be wonderful. But And then you said that there was this fight, and maybe it was an echo of what happened before. And I found very interesting is what happens in the family. Are the unsaid stuff having an echo later because they are not dealt with? I don't know, but there's something like that in my family. I think as nobody talked after the war about what happened, the silence got too big and too present, and maybe there was this kind of a can you say that in English? Rupture, breakup within the family, because there was too much denial and unsaid stuff. That's my rapid analysis, but maybe wrong.
Yeah, I think anytime you sort of touch upon inheritance, if every family is going to have those fights and those ruptures, and they're just, and my experience, they're not often dealt with, and yet they're going to sort of simmer, even if they're patched over, they simmer. And I was terrified. When I began the reclamation process, I knew I couldn't avoid there was a humongous fight in my family for 10 years. And, they had sort of made nice, like the legal issues had been resolved, and everyone had basically were getting along, were cordial. But how could I open an inheritance claim with avoiding sort of all that pain? And it was tough. I sort of had to, there was a lot of conversations sort of while I was writing the book, while the galleys were being prepared about that.
And did you have members of the family read things in advance, or they didn't read it till it came out?
Well, there was I have an uncle he was, I would say, who the fight was with, for lack of a better word. And that's by the time the book came out, he was very, very sick, so he never read the book. But I was sort of, I felt a lot of trepidation how his children would. And he passed away about 6 weeks after the book came out. And I mean, he had been sick for a while, and so but I didn't know how his children, when someone passes, their legacy sorts of gets solidified, and you're saying, okay, we remember this person, and things get burnished. And I just didn't know, like, the fact that I was writing something in public about him, and that sort of happened basically at the same time that he died, and these two things happening, like, that's I was very nervous about it. It turned out to be okay. No one really sort of picked a fight with me, but I don't know what kind of conversations they were having while I wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. And Pauline, you had a sort of similar situation within your own family.
Yes. No, my uncle who passed away a few months ago, Michel, he wrote me a very nice message saying thank you for telling all these souvenirs. I may have not remembered them all, but thank you. It's so nice to come back on the past. And he didn't get into the details, but he was very. I felt very relieved that he liked, because you feel sometimes. Why am I the person who speaks about the family? I mean, I may not be the person who has the right to do it. There's always this question when you do this kind of quest. So I was worried. I wanted him not to feel betrayed. So it was important for me to receive his message.
Your uncle, Michel Strauss, was very prominent in the art world. He was the director of Sotheby's Impressionist and Modern Art worldwide. And he certainly was in a position to know quite a bit about your great-grandfather. And yet that knowledge was never really conveyed to you. In both of your families, there was knowledge that was suppressed or forgotten. Menachem tells a very moving story about when during the research, your family finds, I believe in the closet or a basement, a box of old film reels. And there's a really nice story that you tell about some footage of Havdalah ceremony with your grandfather. And he had this custom, a minhag, of taking wine and putting it on, using the Havdalah wine, putting it on his eyes or putting it in his pocket to, I guess, carry through the week, the sweetness through the week. And that was a pretty dramatic and unusual custom, but no one really, even though you did Havdalah all the time, your family never really talked to you about it. So these, in the process, lots of memories were recovered or.
But Michael, you forget the end of the story, which is beautiful, is that the fact that, sorry Menachem, because it's your story, but the fact he watched the film, it made him do it again. So
yes,
the memory came back.
They adopted it. They adopted it and revived it, reconnected with it, right?
Well, you know, I think one of the sort of more local tragedies of the war is that it's with all these sort of family stories, and in my family, like stories are ritualized. I think the war destroyed a lot of those. A lot of these personal stories, these personal legacies, these personal traditions, they would have gotten passed down, just didn't. And so a lot feels lost.
Right, right. Even that your grandfather survived was.
Yeah, even though there's a connection, it's just we maybe take for granted that within families, especially that you could sort of trace back up these sort of family traditions, stories, legacies, myths, legends, but like just it was all gone.
Right. So you're
reconnecting. It's true what. Sorry. No, I just wanted to underline the idea of myth, because sometimes these myths are really very difficult to come back on. Like in my family, it was like the myth was nothing happened to us during the war. We were very lucky because my grandfather stayed in Paris and wasn't deported, but still he was he had to move in. He was persecuted and he was looted. But there's all this mythology, and you don't want people in your family to discover things or to uncover things they didn't want to look at. That's the difficult point.
Mm-hmm. Right, you're right, Menachem. Origin stories of families are often riddled with error or mythology. So it's true for both of you. Menachem, you went on a Fulbright to Poland or to Lithuania.
To Lithuania, yeah.
Lithuania, and then that was what sort of prompted all of this research. And you talk about being what you call a memory tourist, where Pauline lived in the very city in Paris where a lot of this crime occurred and where the violence and the theft actually occurred. Pauline, what do you think of this term memory tourist, and how does that?
It's a very, very good expression. And before reading Menachem, I didn't realize we were so many. But I think I was a bit like that, I must admit, a memory traveler, tourist, but in my own city. And the coincidence is funny, because I just moved in a new place next to the Louvre Museum, and all my research started at the Louvre. And I was just right in the middle of a Jeu de Paume, where the things have been looted, a Musée du Louvre, where my great-grandfather gave things and had a file that explained what happened to him a bit, Musée d'Orsay. So I was just in the middle of everything and I knew nothing. So it was a great time to, but the research, I had to go to Germany too, actually. I didn't dig into the caves like you, but I had to dig into the archives, right. The Nazi archives.
In each case, Pauline and Menachem, there were earlier attempts by your relatives to achieve restitution. Your great-grandmother tried to have some works restituted. Menachem, your grandfather tried to get the property restituted. Do you think there's something that has changed now that has made it perhaps somewhat easier for people to achieve this since the time of your immediate post-war period?
Well, I mean, for me, for sure, it's the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, like the Poland became an independent country again, and so at least ostensibly there are laws that it's even possible. I don't, I've tried to sort of understand the legal landscape of private property in Poland and reclamation. It's just very difficult. There were certain programs, mostly spearheaded by the US, in order to pay restitution to Polish citizens. But by and large, it was basically a hopeless cause.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be very difficult in Poland now, but in France, it's improved. The past 15 years, it's getting easier because government has really said that they want to give back the things that have been looted. they say it, and it's true that they really want, but then there's a matter of money. They don't put so much money in research. So there's a bit of a décalage between what they say and what happens. I think it's going to improve because I heard there are 14 paintings that are being given back these days. I feel it's improving. The access to the archives are very good, and people are very, very helpful in the French archives, I must say. But what's difficult now is that people have forgotten what happened. You know, we are the last. I feel we are almost the last generation. You're younger than me, but we are the last generation that will be able to know things and to find things. And later, it will be too late soon to go into the archives and remember the names, the address, the first names, all the details that. What you say when you find a building, but then you find out it's not the right number. These small details, because your father or the documents tell you things. Soon we won't be able to know that, I think, because the people who lived during just right after the war, they will be dead, and we won't have anyone to ask.
Mm-hmm. Did you both experienced anti-Semitic responses along the way? Can you talk a little bit about that and how you reacted to those?
Sure. I don't feel I experienced anti-Semitic responses. Like, I don't feel along the way that any particular person in the system responded with an anti-Semitic attitude, anything of this kind. I think what was more challenging and what took me longer to discern was a sort of a systemic bias, perhaps, or at least a sort of, that the fact that no one at any point had been proactive about making claims like mine easier to pursue. And I think it exposed a kind of structural indifference, and not just Jewish claims. I think there's other people who had been displaced who are trying to get their property back. And it's just the legal system, even if everyone is acting, according to the law, and it's, the law wasn't written anti-Semitically, it just will end up frustrating people with very valid claims, because a claim like mine and a claim like Pauline, that's reaching across generations, requires, special laws and, special kind of activism. Until that happens, it's almost guaranteed that most of these things are just going to fail, because it's either too hard just to do bureaucratically, or people just don't have, for me, I'm very lucky that I was able to spend time in Poland doing this, but otherwise it'd be impossible. And so I do until these things are addressed, of making it easier. I think that is a function of like systemic anti-Semitism. Yeah, but I would say I don't feel justified in saying I experienced anti-Semitism in sort of the classic way.
Well, you wrote several times you thought people would see you, oh, here comes the Jew to reclaim the property, once you sort of identified yourself. Was that your own self-awareness?
Yeah, I struggle with that. There's this trope. There's this trope of like the Jew coming back for his property, but it comes from a place of fear. And so I think that's a hard question of like, how do we classify that? I end up being very kind of weird and defensive about the term anti-Semitism vis-a-vis Poland. And so I do think there's a sort of a myth. There's like a lot of myths and tropes that are anti-Semitic, but I get very nervous as sort of a banding about the term or accusing anyone of it if they're sort of expressing fear. It gets tricky because, like you're saying, well, there's an anti-Semitic attitude that's been fostered and sometimes exploited. And so, like, if you see these cartoons or these political cartoons, or when it shows up in elections of people sort of using the Jew as a boogeyman, that is overt anti-Semitism. But I get like very weird and semantic about it. So, I don't know, tricky.
Well, there's reason to be wary, given a
Mm.
lot of things that have been happening in Poland in the recent years. There's a law that was passed by the nationalist government making it illegal to accuse Poles of complicity in the Holocaust. Yeah. So, and there was an article recently.
I think the government is terrible. I think that, the government since 2015 has become, a nationalist revisionist government with as at at best, I would call it anti-history, and at worst, I would call it, borderline anti-Semitic, like a sort of historical memory legislation.
And Pauline, your experience with this question?
Well, I think you're right, Menachem. I didn't feel exactly that, but I felt the amnesia was going towards was anti-Semitic in a way, because when I went to Dresden and the director asked me, maybe your great-grandfather was very happy to sell his painting in 1941. I thought, how can he forget the anti-Jewish laws? So I was a bit shocked because it was obvious that there was an amnesia. So it's more an anti-story than anti-Semitism, but at that point it's the same, I would say.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the decision that you made to write this book, your books as a memoir. I think, Malcolm, you write that you played with the idea of writing it as a novel. Do you think you made the right decision? Would you?
Of course.
I'll even take a step back. It's like I actually was pretty adamant against writing it at all. When it was just about reclamation, going back to what we said before, I didn't have the sentimental relationship, so I didn't know really where the arc was, and so I was very opposed to it. It wasn't until I sort of had this, long, it's not for this conversation, long zany adventure with treasure hunters, that I felt that maybe it was a book. But at the end of the day, yeah, I felt, fiction allows you. I had a lot of holes in my story, like I had all these gaps, and so intuitively you're like, okay, you could write a novel and sort of fill those in. You could set the stakes yourself. But at the end of the day, and I'd be very interested in hearing Pauline also on this point. But what makes my story a story are the mistakes, are the errors, are the sort of like mishaps, the missteps, the typos. It's not linear. These things are never go the way you planned, and I don't know how to do that in a novel. Like I don't know sort of how to use sort of a capture like the bumps in a memoir. It just doesn't really have to make sense. It doesn't have to go as planned. You could admit you made a mistake. You could sort of abandon the narrative, restart again, sort of reset the narrative. And so at the end of the day, I felt, I was like, oh, it'd be easier to do as a novel, but I feel very grateful that I made the decision I did.
I think you're right, because you said at the end of your book, of course, if you hadn't written a memoir, how would you have expressed? What's the most interesting thing for me is how you feel, your doubts, your mistakes, as you say. It was the same for me. I wanted to say the truth, because it was quite overwhelming for me to go through this adventure. So I thought, what else can I imagine? I mean, if it's to say I discovered more paintings or more expensive paintings, it's not the interesting part. And how there's a sense of loyalty to it. I mean, you talk about ancestors and they never allowed you to talk about them, then you're going to lie about them as well. It's too much. I mean, I had the sense of it had to be true, even though it was not always solved. A lot of people told me, oh, but not everything is solved in your book. I was like, okay, I'm very sorry. But it's true. I don't know exactly what happened during the war, and I don't have an answer for everything, but I prefer to share that with you. But in France, it's a bit different than in the States or in England, maybe. We don't mind a little mix of memoir and novel. But for a friend who's a great writer, she told me, but how do you care? I mean, you can change a few stuff. I said, no, I can't do that. and I'm glad I didn't do it, because Michael wouldn't have been happy. But we in France, they don't mind mixing stuff. I think it's a bit of a pity to make it in between genre. It's a pity with this kind of adventure.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I so loved about Pauline's book is that you, especially in the beginning, you see her accept the story. She's like, that is part of the process of like, it doesn't start with her trying to reclaim the paintings. It's sort of that process of her being like, oh, this is a story and this is my story. and I'm going to write it. And I felt it very transparent and very honest. And that's kind of what I'm always going to be most interested in.
That's kind, because what I like about you is that you always have these questions about who am I, what kind of quest is it, what is my motivation, I think you have a very, when you say we are not sentimental, but you get a bit sentimental sometimes. You defend yourself from being sentimental. Yeah. And I like this approach, this very raising always questions about what angle should I take, how should I look at things. And I think I felt the same. I think my book seems a bit more naive to me now that I've read your book, but that's the way I am.
Well, Menachem, there's a beautiful sentence in his book that I think really applies to both of you and what you were trying to achieve and your own conclusions. I won't speak for you, but you can comment after I've read this. It's just a brief sentence. The more I think about it, the more I think that in the most morally honest version of the story, the reclamation would be perpetual, irresolvable, Sisyphean. My children and their children should inherit not the building, but the struggle to reclaim it, the struggle to understand what it is they're trying to reclaim. So for both of you, the book and the search and this ongoing effort is really what you've come back to and what you've got out of it all. You know?
Yeah, you're right. But that's you said that, Menachem, that you were touched by the fact that your grandfather had to claim for 20 years. I don't remember how long, but the fact that he had to fight and claim for so long. It was the same for me. It was my grandmother who asked for 10 paintings for 15 years, and I tried to figure out how is it like to claim something that belonged to you, to go through all that difficult time, and then to receive at the end a no. I mean, she got nothing, no acknowledgement of loss or nothing. So it's true that there's transmission of this state of mind, and this loss, and the fact that they lost. I don't know how to say it.
Well, Pauline, what did it feel like to get a yes?
No, but it felt like you said at the end of the book, it's good, but it's not all, because it's just an object. It's not, you don't get closer to your family, you don't get to know them. You still miss something, you miss a story that hasn't been told. So you get a painting and it's great, and it's justice and all the words that that are so cliche, but it's true. You feel it's justice has been done. You think something is the end of something, but still there's a little frustration that I don't know my great-grandfather better. I will never know what he's been through during the war, and there's still a lot of missing points.
Well, both of your books very movingly convey how this incredible act of violence against Jews continues to reverberate so many generations later and 3/4 of a century on. That and there is, it's difficult to can't be repaired. There's no good side of the story. All right, Sandrine, are we ready to have some questions?
I have only one question for now, but I think the people will come. So one first question: growing up in France, is official or non-official attitude towards Jews during after World War II must have definitely prevented Pauline's family from continuing any of their religious or cultural Jewish traditions.
So can you repeat the question? Sorry, was it a question or an assertion?
There is a question mark at the end of the sentence, but yeah, is that the official or non-official attitude towards Jews during and after World War II in France must have definitely prevented Pauline's family from continuing any of their religious and or cultural Jewish traditions.
But they had none. I'm afraid. Religious traditions. No, what's true about the claims and the things like that is that after the war, the people, and my family was like that too, some people didn't want to talk about it and to go back. I mean, they escaped from, they were alive and they didn't want to talk about it. It's more, I didn't say that, but that would explain the silence. About the government's attitude, I don't know. I think it was maybe still a bit anti-Semite, but I don't know exactly how it was like to be Jewish after the war, except that you had gone through so much that maybe you didn't want to talk about it.
Another question, Pauline, how did your non-Jewish friends and colleagues respond to your quest to reclaim the painting?
No problem, Jewish or non-Jewish, they completely understood my quest. I mean, I was lucky that people understood that I was searching for some kind of history that was missing and justice that was missing. So they were really supportive, Jewish or non-Jewish.
A precise question, who were the Nazi officials and art dealers involved in the theft and subsequent sales of your family's paintings?
Oh, I know just the two that took part in the that looted the two paintings, one drawing and one painting that were restituted. One was bought, the Tiepolo drawing was bought for Hitler's museum, the Musée de Linz, and it was by Erhard Goppel, who would buy things for Hitler. And the second person who bought for the L'Argilière was bought for the Reichsbank by a lady called Margot Janssen. There's a very good book by Hector Feliciano, which is called the Lost Museum, I think. And he says about this lady that sold for the Reichsbank. So I know about these two persons, but they were two red flags well known by the authorities, and they were condemned after the war.
Et je recommande le livre de Emmanuel Pollack, Le marché de l'art.
Ah oui. Yeah, it's very good. It's very good. Is it translated?
No.
It should.
Yeah.
It said that the art market in France was really going on very well because all the Jewish things that were looted and then sold on the market, or the people who were forced to leave France had to sell their artworks, and so it says about all this market and that happened during the war. It's very interesting, and the auctions and.
A question from Leslie Eisenberg. Bonjour, Madame de Perignon. Do you have thoughts as to why your aunt, to whom you were very close, was not more forthcoming with information?
Sorry, pardon, Sandrine, j'ai pas compris.
Do you have thoughts as to why your aunt, pensez? Est-ce que
you have thoughts? Ah ouais.
To why your aunt, to whom you were very close, was not more forthcoming with information?
Because she was 14 at the beginning of the war, so she didn't know much. And at the end of the war, people wouldn't tell her. Her own mother didn't say she was, she made claims, and she really didn't know more than and she really tried to tell me as much as she could. I could see that on her face. And what she told me after a few years came back to her mind in a really natural way. You know, it's like your memory sometimes forgetting and it comes back. So she was not trying to hide anything, but she knew little. But she knew much more important things that helped me, like, you know, sometimes details. And so even though she didn't know about the looted art, she knew a few stuff about her. And she has a very good memory about her childhood, so it's very precious.
Pauline, maybe say a little bit about the role of Patrick Modiano in your research that you're interested
in. Yeah, no, it was much fun because I tried to follow him in the street, and I knew he was very good with, he knows everything about Paris and where people lived and who lived in what building. You know, he has this, all his work and all his life is about memory and never to forget the people. So he has this huge knowledge and a beautiful obsession with keeping memory. So I told him, just like out of the blue in the street, hello, Mr. Modiano, I'm looking for my great-grandfather who lived 60 Avenue Foch. And said, oh yes, of course, Jules Strauss. He's like, it's as if we were talking about groceries, you know, or where's the, you know, the direction or anything. Oh yes, of course. I know that his apartment was, how do you say, seized or occupied by a Nazi person called Kurt Molaz. Kurt, really? Of course, no one told me about that because my aunt, she told me, oh, the flat was too big. He had to move in somewhere else. So I discovered, thanks to him, what happened during the war to my great-grandfather.
There is a question from Menachem. Can you speak more about the property? Is it a family home or a business property, and does it still exist?
Yeah, it still exists. It's well, it gets a little complicated. What I thought it was about like a, just like a 4-story apartment building with probably, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 units. I spent about 2 years sort of investigating it, meeting the residents, until I realized because of a typo, I was actually in the wrong building. So the correct building was down the street, and it's similar. It's kind of older. It's a corner building, kind of run down. People live in those apartments, so definitely still exists. And you know, I imagine it looked the same way back, back before the war. One of the other mistakes I made was that it wasn't actually where my grandfather grew up. I thought it was, and so I had this, this sentimental thing. I was like, my grandfather's childhood home, but it was actually just an investment property. And the irony is that he also owned the home he had grown up in, but we just didn't have any of the paperwork. Like that one was a lost cause. Like that would never happen. But it was an investment property that existed in the family, and that my grandfather had tried to reclaim for almost 30 years before he died.
Another question for you. You said when your book was published, it did not seem to hurt your relationship with your cousins. As time passed, has that changed or possibly improved the relationship?
I mean, it sort of just went the same. The book didn't really seem to have an effect much either way. And so it sort of just, it was like a blip, I think. And then there's also part of the book is I meet another branch of the family you didn't know existed. And so that's been interesting, sort of meeting a whole new branch of Kaisers in South America, Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, and in Israel. So, I wouldn't say improved, but it's new, it's new family members.
A question for both of you. Would you be interested in advocating towards changing laws pertaining to property art reclaiming?
Could you ask one more time?
Would you be interested in advocating towards changing laws pertaining to property art reclaiming?
I see.
Yeah, that's of course. But I tried. I went to Brussels and I talked to the parliament. I knew it was a bit desperate, but I did it. So that there's one law for all Europe, because nowadays every country has its own laws, and I think it would be good to have a uniform law for plunders and looted art, but I'm not sure it will ever happen. I'm not too naive about that. What do you think, Menachem?
Part of the thing is I don't speak the language of the country I'm sort of dealing with, and so I'm limited. I'm very limited, and I can't read or write in Polish. There's certain organizations that are doing good work that have asked me to speak or to submit some stuff. So I've done that. But it's just very hard because it's such a high level conversation. So it's very hard as like a private citizen how to be able to contribute. So when asked, I'm happy to do it, but I don't know how I could sort of decide to become an advocate for this kind of stuff. I wrote a book, past that, I feel kind of limited.
The best way of participating, I think I'm like you, I'm not very at ease with administrative stuff. I can say my story again and again, but I don't feel I can go again to parliaments or official stuff, and
I also, to be honest, I never felt like I was on like a mission, like a wider mission. I felt it was a very personal thing. And so I didn't, even when I sort of encountered resistance, I never felt like I was making a big statement. I felt like I was pursuing something meaningful and interesting to me. And if other people found it interesting and meaningful or related to it, that was great. But I have a hard time. It doesn't sit well, like this activism in this space. I wouldn't know where to start.
No more questions for now.
There was the one about the treasure hunters.
Yeah, sorry. What about the treasure hunters that converted to Judaism?
I'm not sure what that means. I think that maybe means treasure hunters who had a Jewish grandparent. I don't know any treasure hunters who converted to Judaism, but there are some with a Jewish grandparent who didn't necessarily identify as Jewish, but it was a big part of their identity that they had a Jewish grandparent who was in concentration camps. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, they were there. They're still doing the work. They're still treasure hunting. But that would be really interesting to meet a treasure hunter who converted to Judaism, but I don't know of any.
I'm collecting Nazi trophies.
Exactly.
Any more comments? Let's see. What is your legacy, knowing what you know now?
Oh my God, it would be pretentious to talk about legacy. What I'm trying to do is to talk about what I have learned to my kids, and I try to help a bit other families when they ask me, where did you find this and this? What can I do with my research? I send them a few stuff I know, or I send them the address of the archives. I don't know if I have a legacy. I just try to explain to the people that they have to do it themselves, not to wait too much or to expect too much from anyone else, and to do the research themselves. That's what I try to tell. It's not a legacy, it's just an advice for all the families looking for their own history. And just no more silence. Let's try to talk about what happened, and you know what's nice in the story is that when you talk about your family, it's not only about the dramas, it's always what you say, Menachem, when you watch the film of your grandfather and you discovered how elegant, how he behaved. And I want to that's my legacy, is to not to forget our ancestors. Let's not forget them.
Yes, something similar. Legacy is a weird word to try on, but I think if there's a lesson that I was able to impart, it's that it's sort of worthwhile to investigate our own stories, even though if they feel very familiar, because just weird things happen. Over the last 11 months since my book came out, I've received just so much correspondence and comments and questions about people's own stories of recovery or their parents' story of recovery. And people are not most of them are not trying to get buildings back or pieces of art, but they have a story in their family. And to the extent that my book was able to inspire people to sort of step into that story and complicate the story and find out how it's weird and what they got wrong and find what's myth and what's history. That is the only real lesson I feel confident to impart to people.
And I will take the last question, which was also mine, but it's Brent McDonough who asked that. What are your next projects?
I don't know. I will be honest with you. It's difficult to change completely. I thought I would find a completely new project, but everything pulls me back to this investigation, the people who send me letters, the families. I discover families that knew my family. It's very difficult to change the subject after such a quest. So I don't know. Well, I don't know what's my next project, I must admit. And you, Menachem?
Yeah, it's the biggest project is a documentary film about the Golden Train. And so that's going in fits and starts. And yeah, but I kind of, like you, Pauline, I'm like, okay, I feel I want to get out, but it's hard. It's hard to get out. These stories become rich and they keep sprawling and you keep getting pulled back in. But oh, and go back to fiction. I would like to go back to fiction writing.
It's difficult to find a fiction subject that is as interesting as this non-fiction project, isn't it?
Yeah. I feel a little bit of fatigue from sort of talking about the war, actually. And so and it's very important and I'm very happy I did it, but there is a sense of fatigue of sort of writing into that and talking about it and being, having to, sit in it. And so, yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to maybe take a step back, but I'm failing. I'm completely failing, but I'm going to try.
Well, tell me when you find out. I'm curious.
Thanks, Pauline.
I think that's it. Michael?
Thank you very much, all of you, for taking part.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sandrine. Thank you, Menachem.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
It was great. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Enjoy your afternoon or your evening in Paris.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.